a work of fiction. The Pope, cardinals, and institution depicted below are invented characters and do not represent any real person or living pontiff. On the night of June 26th, inside the Paul XVI Hall, 120 cardinals sat frozen, not because of what Pope Cassian I had just said, but because of what he had just done. In front of every cardinal, in front of the cameras, in front of the entire Catholic world watching live, this quiet American Pope had just detonated the single most calculated move in modern Vatican history. And by the time anyone understood what was happening, it was already too late to stop him. The extraordinary consistory had been announced weeks earlier. Most people barely paid attention. The Vatican holds these meetings. Cardinals gather, they talk, they pray, they go home. That is how it usually works. That is what everyone expected. The agenda seemed ordinary. A discussion about peace, a reflection on the Synod, a session on how the Church communicates in the modern world. Nothing that would make headlines, nothing that would shake foundations. At least, that is what it looked like. But Cassian had been planning something very different, and the first sign came not in Rome, but 6,000 miles away. 3 weeks before the consistory, Pope Cassian I had landed in Spain. The trip was supposed to be pastoral. Madrid, Barcelona, the Canary Islands, masses, speeches, crowds, the kind of trip a pope does. 7 days on the road, millions of people lining the streets, the largest papal visit to Spain in over a decade. But those who watched closely noticed something unusual. Cassian was not just preaching. He was testing messages, planting seeds, calibrating language he would need later. In Madrid, standing before a massive crowd, he said something most commentators glossed over. He said that Christ walks the streets, crosses the squares, and visits our neighborhoods, that he is a God who is close, a God who walks with his people, the Lord of history. Normal papal language, right? Except Cassian was not talking about theology. He was laying the groundwork. He was telling the world, in plain sight, what kind of church he intended to build. A church that moves. A church that walks into the mess of real life, not a church that hides behind marble walls. In Barcelona, he visited an ancient monastery perched on a jagged mountain. He prayed in silence for nearly 30 minutes. Cameras watched. Commentators speculated. Was he reflecting? Was he struggling with some decision? Nobody knew. But later, a member of his inner circle would say that Cassian already had the entire consistory mapped out in his head. Every question, every provocation, every silence. He was not praying for guidance. He was praying for courage. Then he went to the Canary Islands, the edges of Europe, the places the Vatican usually forgets. He met with migrant families. He visited communities that had not seen a bishop in years. And he listened. He sat in small rooms with people who had nothing and listened to them describe their faith, their struggles, their sense of abandonment by an institution that was supposed to care for them. Those conversations would resurface at the consistory, almost word for word. And the people who most needed to hear that echo were not in Spain. They were in Rome. While Cassian was in Barcelona, a small group of cardinals back in the Vatican were already uneasy. Word had reached them that the consistory would not follow the usual format. There would be no pre-approved talking points distributed in advance, no carefully negotiated communiqué drafted before anyone even sat down. Cassian wanted open dialogue, real questions, real answers, and he wanted it broadcast. That last detail made several senior members of the Curia very uncomfortable. Back in Rome after Spain, Cassian spent 3 days at his summer residence outside the city, a 17th-century palace overlooking a quiet lake. He read. He walked the gardens. He met with almost no one. His staff said he was resting after the grueling Spanish itinerary, but rest was not what was happening behind those walls. Cassian was reviewing files, dossiers prepared by his closest advisors, reports from every continent about the state of the Church on the ground. Not the Church as seen from Rome, the Church as experienced by ordinary Catholics. and the picture those reports painted was devastating. Declining mass attendance across Europe, seminary closures in North America, entire regions of Latin America where evangelical churches were growing 10 times faster than Catholic parishes, a generation of young people in Asia and Africa who respected the Pope as a figure but felt no connection to the institution. Cassian absorbed all of it, and he decided the consistory would not be another diplomatic exercise. It would be a reckoning. But on June 16th, something happened that changed the trajectory of everything. A group of journalists caught him leaving the residence. They asked him about a breakaway traditionalist fraternity, call them the Confraternity of St. Boniface, that had been openly defying him for months. They had announced plans to consecrate 4 new bishops on July 1st without his permission, a direct challenge to his authority, a schismatic act, the kind of move the Church had not seen in decades. Cassian, standing outside in the sun with no prepared statement, no press secretary beside him, looked at the cameras and spoke. He said he was considering one more appeal. He said he might ask them one last time, "Do not do this. Let us try to live in communion within the Church." But then he added something that stunned everyone. "It is their choice," he said. "We need to realize what this means, for them and for the Church. Division is always painful. However, they refuse to accept certain fundamental elements of the Church, and while I regret that choice, we must move forward. We must move forward. 4 words. And in those 4 words, every assumption about Pope Cassian I shattered, because the world had been told a story about this pope. The media had built a narrative. Cassian was the peacemaker, the bridge builder, the quiet friar from the American Midwest who would heal divisions and calm the storms his predecessor had stirred up. He was supposed to be the pope who would bring the traditionalists back into the fold, who would soften the edges, who would compromise. That was the story, and Cassian had let that story circulate for over a year. He never corrected it. He never pushed back. He let people believe what they wanted to believe. But that was the strategy. What almost nobody in the media grasped was that Cassian had never intended to bring the traditionalists back by giving them what they wanted. He intended to bring them back by making the Church so clearly, so undeniably committed to its own path that the only choice left would be to walk with it or walk away. He was not closing doors. He was defining the building. And if some people did not want to live in that building, that was, as he said, their choice. The consistory was where all of this came together. June 26th, Friday morning, Mass in the Basilica. 120 cardinals from every continent. Cassian presided. The homily was short. He spoke about the vine, about Christ's words, "I am the true vine." He talked about unity, not the kind that comes from ignoring problems, but the kind that comes from obedience, from listening, from accepting that the Spirit might be leading the Church somewhere uncomfortable. After Mass, they moved to the Paul VI Hall. Cardinal Alaric Voss, the Dean of the College of Cardinals, gave the opening address. Then Cassian stood, and this is where the world's assumptions began to fall apart. Cassian did not give a speech. He asked a question. He looked at the assembled cardinals and said, "In what kind of world are we called to proclaim the gospel?" And then he sat down. He did not elaborate. He did not offer his own answer. He just asked the question and waited. The silence lasted 11 seconds. It felt like 11 minutes. A cardinal from Eastern Europe was the first to speak. He offered a biblical meditation, but within minutes the conversation shifted. Cardinals began talking, not in the usual polished Vatican style with carefully worded interventions read from prepared texts, but actually talking, sharing, describing what they saw in their own countries, their own dioceses, the wars, the poverty, the young people leaving the faith, the rise of artificial intelligence reshaping how people think, the polarization tearing societies apart. And Cassian sat there listening, taking notes, saying almost nothing. But what happened next changed everything. The afternoon session was supposed to focus on power and what Cassian's own writings called The Civilization of Love. Cardinal Emil Duarte, the prefect of the doctrinal office, was scheduled to introduce the theme. He did. He drew from Cassian's own encyclical on technology and human dignity. He talked about how technology is never neutral, how it takes on the character of those who build and use it, how the Church must engage with artificial intelligence not as a crisis to manage, but as a challenge that demands a rethinking of its entire social doctrine. But then Duarte did something unexpected. He pivoted. He brought up the confraternity situation directly, in front of all the cardinals, and laid out the timeline. The failed negotiations, the fraternity's refusal to suspend their plans, an open letter they had sent just 2 days earlier, a lengthy profession of faith denouncing the modern church as a ship lost at sea. The room tensed. Several conservative cardinals shifted in their seats. This was not on the agenda. This was not how the Vatican does things. You do not air internal conflicts in front of the full college. You handle these things quietly, through back channels, through diplomatic language and careful maneuvering. But Cassian had told Duarte to do it. That was the point. Because Cassian wanted every cardinal to see the situation clearly, not filtered through rumor, not softened by diplomatic ambiguity. He wanted them to see what the fraternity was actually saying, that the reforms of the last 60 years were a betrayal, that the only true church was one frozen in the past. And then he wanted them to see something else, something most of the outside world had completely missed, that the same impulse to resist, to freeze the church in a moment that felt safe, was not limited to the breakaway group. It existed inside the room. It existed among cardinals who would never associate themselves with the schism, but who, in practice, operated from the same fear, that moving forward meant losing something essential, that change meant compromise, that the world was too dangerous to engage with. Cassian was not attacking anyone. He was holding up a mirror. Then he spoke. He stood slowly, adjusted his glasses, and said something that would be quoted in every newspaper, every broadcast, every Catholic blog on the planet within hours. "We cannot build the civilization of love if we are afraid of the world God created," he said. "Fear does not protect the faith. Fear buries it." The room went completely still. He continued. He talked about his trip to Spain, how he had visited neighborhoods where the church had no presence, how he had met families who had never seen a priest, how he had sat with young people who told him they believed in God but could not recognize him in the institution that claimed to represent him. "That is our failure," he said. "Not theirs. Ours. We made the church a fortress when it was meant to be a field hospital." That phrase, a field hospital, was not new. It echoed something his predecessor had said years earlier, but Cassian was not recycling language. He was reclaiming it. He was saying, this idea was right, and we have not done enough with it. And the reason we have not done enough is because too many of us in this room were more comfortable with the fortress. Several cardinals looked down. Others nodded. A few looked visibly angry. But Cassian was not finished. He brought up his own encyclical, released just 1 month earlier, the first of his pontificate, a document most secular commentators had dismissed as a routine statement about technology. They were wrong. Cassian had personally presented it at the Vatican, breaking with tradition. Most popes delegate that task to cardinals. He wanted his own voice attached to every word. And now, at the consistory, he connected it to everything happening in the room. He said the encyclical was not really about technology. It was about a choice. The same choice humanity faces in every era. The same choice the church faced in that room, that day. Whether to build a tower to climb higher, or a city to reach wider. He said the confraternity had made their choice. They wanted the tower. They wanted to reach heaven by going backward, by climbing on the rubble of everything the church had learned in 60 years. "I will not join them on that climb," he said, "but I will pray for them, because the fall from a tower built on pride is always devastating." That was the moment. That was the moment the world realized it had been wrong about Cassian Ewing. He was not the quiet compromiser. He was not the soft-spoken bridge builder waiting to make everyone happy. He was a strategist who had spent 14 months letting people underestimate him, letting the narrative form around him like fog, and then, at the exact moment of maximum impact, burned the fog away. But what happened on the second day of the consistory was even more shocking. Saturday, June 27th. The cardinals returned expecting the discussion to continue in the same format: open dialogue, reflections, maybe a closing statement. Instead, Cassian changed the entire structure of the session. He told them they would not be discussing themes. They would be discussing people, real people, specific situations. He had prepared case studies, not from academic sources but from parish priests, missionaries, chaplains in war zones and refugee camps. Stories of real Catholics facing impossible situations. A woman in Central Africa excommunicated for remarrying after her husband was killed by militia. A family in Southeast Asia whose parish had closed for lack of priests. A teenager in Germany who left the church after being told that asking questions meant he lacked faith. A grandmother in South America who walked 4 hours every Sunday because her village had not had a resident priest in over a decade. A young father in East Asia who wanted to baptize his child but was told his interfaith marriage made it complicated. Cassian read each case aloud, slowly, with detail. He named the woman in Africa. He described her village the day she was told she could no longer receive communion. Some cardinals looked visibly shaken. Others tried to maintain composure. But the room was different now. The air felt different because these were not statistics. These were human beings. And after each one he asked the same question. What does the Church owe this person? Not what does doctrine say. Not what is the canonical position. What does the Church owe this person? It was a masterful move because it forced the cardinals to stop talking about the Church as an institution and start talking about it as a community of human beings. It forced them out of abstraction and into reality. And it exposed something Cassian had clearly identified months earlier: the enormous, growing gap between the Church's official positions and the lived experience of its members. A gap not caused by the world changing too fast, but by the Church changing too slow. Several cardinals pushed back. One argued the Church could not abandon its teachings to accommodate every individual situation. Another warned that this approach risked turning the Church into a social services agency rather than a guardian of eternal truth. Cassian listened to all of it. Then he answered with 5 words that cut through every argument. Mercy is not a compromise. He let that settle. Then he added, "We have been acting as though compassion weakens doctrine. It does not. Compassion is doctrine. If our theology cannot hold a suffering person, then our theology is incomplete." The conservative cardinals did not applaud, but they did not object either, because the argument was not progressive or conservative. It was not political. It was pastoral. And Cassian had framed it in a way that made opposition look like indifference to suffering. Not wrong, not heretical, just cold. And that was deliberate, because Cassian understood something most popes before him had struggled with. The battle inside the Church was never really about theology. It was about temperature, warm versus cold, engaged versus detached, present versus absent. And he had just moved the thermostat. By the time the consistory closed Saturday evening, the mood in the Vatican had fundamentally shifted. Not because Cassian had imposed new rules or issued decrees, but because he had done something far more powerful. He had changed the conversation. For months, the conversation inside the Vatican had been about resistance, about the confraternity, about traditionalists versus reformers, about who was right and who was wrong. Cassian erased that conversation and replaced it with a different question. Not who is right, but who are we serving? Not what are we preserving, but who are we reaching? And in doing so, he neutralized his opposition without ever confronting them directly. Because you cannot argue against serving people. You cannot stand in a room full of cardinals and say, "No, we should not care about that woman in Africa. No, we should not worry about that teenager in Germany." The moment you try, you have already lost. That was the trap, and they walked right into it. On Sunday, June 28th, Cassian gave the midday address in the square below his window. The crowd was larger than usual. Word had spread. People wanted to hear from the Pope who had just shaken the College of Cardinals. He spoke about the Gospel reading on detachment, loss, and hospitality, and said something many interpreted as a direct message to the confraternity, though he never named them. "Love requires at least 3 things," he said. "Detachment from what we cling to, acceptance of what we lose, and hospitality toward what is new. If we refuse any of these, we refuse love itself." The traditionalists heard that and understood. The reformers heard it and celebrated. The rest of the world heard it and began to realize that this pope was playing a game no one had anticipated. Because here is what most people still did not understand. Cassian had not just made a theological point at the consistory. He had made a structural one. By forcing the cardinals to engage with real human suffering, by asking, "What do we owe this person?" he had created a new standard, a new test. Every policy, every doctrine, every decision the Church made going forward would now be measured against that question. Not by Cassian, by the cardinals themselves, because they had been in the room. They had heard the stories. They had been forced to respond, and their responses were on record. Cassian had made accountability unavoidable without ever using the word. There was one more detail almost nobody caught at the time. During the first session, when Cassian asked his opening question, he had quoted a line from his own earlier address at a university in Rome, that those who seek truth are ultimately seeking God, whether they realize it or not. It seemed like a throwaway line, a papal platitude. It was not. It was aimed at a very specific audience: the technology sector, the artificial intelligence industry, the same audience his encyclical had addressed. Cassian was not just reforming the Church. He was positioning it. He was saying the Church has something to say about the future, about what it means to be human in an age of machines. And if you think the institution is irrelevant, you have not been paying attention. In the days after the consistory, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Catholic media went into overdrive. Progressive voices praised Cassian for his courage. Conservative voices accused him of ambushing the cardinals. Some called it a setup. Others called it a masterclass. One columnist wrote that Cassian had turned the consistory into a courtroom where the Church itself was on trial. Secular outlets, which usually ignore Vatican politics, ran the story on their front pages because the narrative was irresistible. The quiet pope, who turned out to be the most strategic leader the Church had seen in decades. The man everyone underestimated. The man who waited 14 months and then moved with a precision that left his opponent standing in place, wondering what had just happened. But the most significant reaction came from within the Vatican itself. On the evening of June 28th, a group of senior cardinals requested a private meeting with Cassian. They wanted to understand his intentions, whether the consistory was a one-time event or the beginning of something larger. He received them late in a quiet room overlooking the square, its lights glowing through the windows. He was calm. He offered them coffee. He asked about their health. He made small talk about the weather. Classic Cassian, disarming, warm, making people feel comfortable right before he said something they would never forget. When they asked what his plan was, he gave them the answer that would define the rest of his pontificate. "I have no plan," he said. "I have a direction. Plans are rigid, directions are alive, and the direction is simple. We go where the people are. We listen to what they need, and we respond with everything we have. If that scares you, ask yourself why." The room went quiet. One cardinal looked at the floor. Another cleared his throat. One of them finally said, "Holy Father, some will say you are dismantling tradition." Cassian looked at him without blinking. "I am not dismantling tradition," he said. I am dismantling the excuse that tradition gives us to do nothing." Another cardinal tried a different approach. "But, Holy Father, the faithful in my country want stability. They want to know the Church will not change its core teachings." Cassian nodded. "I agree," he said, "and the core teaching is love. If love is not at the center of every policy, every ruling, every decision we make, then we have already changed the core teaching. We changed it the moment we put something else first." That exchange never made it to the press, but it circulated through Vatican corridors within hours. By Monday morning, every senior official in Rome had heard it, and everyone knew something fundamental had shifted. On June 29th, the feast day commemorating the Church's two foundational apostles, one the rock, one the missionary, stability and movement, tradition and transformation, Cassian used the homily to bring both together. He spoke about how the two apostles had disagreed, argued, confronted each other over including outsiders in the early Church, and he said the Church was born in disagreement. It was born in the tension between staying and going, between holding firm and reaching out. That tension is not a problem, he said. It is our nature. The moment we resolve it, the moment we choose one over the other, we stop being the Church. It was a statement aimed at everyone, at the confraternity who wanted to stay frozen, at the progressives who wanted to move without looking back, at the officials in the Curia who wanted stability above all else. Cassian was telling all of them, "You are wrong if you think this is a zero-sum game. The Church needs both, and I will hold both, even when it hurts." That evening, Cassian returned to his summer residence to draft his final appeal to the confraternity before their planned consecrations on July 1st, an appeal that would ask them, one last time, to turn back. But everyone who had been in the consistory knew the truth. Cassian was not expecting them to turn back. He had already moved forward. He had already defined the Church he was building. And if the confraternity walked away, the loss would be theirs, not his. Because Cassian had done something no one thought possible. He had made the future more compelling than the past, and he had done it on purpose. Every single move, the trip to Spain, the silence at the summer residence, the open question at the consistory, the case studies, the mirror he held up to the cardinals, the encyclical on technology and human dignity, the way he let the world build its assumptions and then shattered them at the perfect moment. All of it was deliberate. All of it was connected. The world had believed Cassian I was a placeholder pope, a transitional figure, a man who would keep the seat warm and avoid controversy. The world believed he was cautious, moderate, safe. The world was wrong. Cassian was never safe. He was patient, and patience combined with clarity and courage is the most dangerous force in any institution, because it does not announce itself. It does not warn. It simply waits until the moment is right, and then it acts, decisively, irreversibly, without apology. The cardinals who left Rome after the consistory understood this, many of them for the first time. They had arrived thinking they were attending a routine meeting. They left knowing they had witnessed the beginning of a transformation, not in doctrine, but in posture, in the way the Church holds itself, in the way it faces the world. Cassian had shifted the center of gravity, and gravity, once shifted, does not go back. In the weeks and months ahead, the implications of what happened in late June would ripple outward into dioceses, into parishes, into the daily lives of 1 billion believers. The question Cassian asked, "What does the Church owe this person?" would become the defining question of his pontificate, not because he made it official, but because he made it unavoidable. And that is the real story. Not that Cassian surprised the world, but that the world was so busy looking at the Pope it expected to see, it missed the Pope who was actually there. He was born in the American Midwest, the son of a working-class family, a friar who joined his order young and then did something unusual. He left the country, not for a few months, but for decades, living in small towns in South America, building parishes from nothing, learning the language like a native, eating with farmers, burying children who died from diseases that should have been curable. He saw what poverty does to faith. He saw what the absence of the church does to communities that need it most. That experience shaped everything: how he leads, how he listens, how he fights. Because Cassian does not fight like a politician. He fights like a pastor who has seen too much suffering to tolerate institutional cowardice. He fights with questions, with silence, with a patience that looks like passivity until the moment it becomes a wall that nothing can move. A man who learned to lead by listening, who learned to fight by staying calm, who learned that the most powerful thing you can do in a room full of powerful people is ask a simple question and wait. The Church had not seen a pope like this in a very long time, maybe ever. And now, for the first time, the world was starting to realize it. Everything they believed about him had just fallen apart, and he would not have had it any other way.